The morning sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban neighborhood when Michelle Johnson's life changed forever. A respected elementary school teacher with 15 years of experience, she was preparing for another day of shaping young minds when loud knocks echoed through her modest two-bedroom home. Standing at her door were three stern-faced FBI agents, their badges glinting in the early morning light. Before she could process what was happening, Michelle found herself being read her Miranda rights. The charges? Alleged cyber espionage and unauthorized access to classified government databases, accusations that made absolutely no sense to the 42-year-old educator who barely used anything beyond email and basic classroom software. "There must be some mistake," she said repeatedly, her voice trembling as neighbors peeked through their curtains at the unfolding scene. The agents remained unmoved, their faces stoic as they led her to an unmarked vehicle. Michelle's students would be waiting for her at school, their morning greeting cards and bright smiles replaced by confusion when the principal would have to explain her absence. The next few hours passed in a blur of fluorescent lights, cold metal chairs, and endless questions. The federal detention center felt like another world entirely, sterile, hostile, and frightening. Michelle's requests to contact her family were met with delays and vague responses. Her court-appointed attorney seemed overwhelmed and distracted, barely making eye contact as he shuffled through the case files. In the holding cell, Michelle wrapped her cardigan tightly around herself, trying to maintain some sense of dignity. Her mind raced through every possible scenario that could have led to this nightmare. Had someone stolen her identity? Was there another Michelle Johnson somewhere who had actually committed these crimes? The walls seemed to close in with each passing hour. What made the situation even more bizarre was the level of security surrounding her case. High-ranking officials from various agencies kept appearing, their whispered conversations just out of earshot. Michelle noticed how they would glance at her with a mix of suspicion and something else, uncertainty, perhaps. Her first court appearance was scheduled for the following morning. As she tried to sleep on the thin prison mattress, Michelle thought about her students, her elderly mother who would be sick with worry, and her reputation in the community she had served faithfully for so many years. Everything she had worked for was hanging by a thread, and she had no idea why. Little did Michelle know that miles away, in a secure government facility, someone was about to discover information that would turn her case on its head. A high-ranking NSA official was burning the midnight oil, poring over data that would reveal a truth far more complex than anyone had imagined. This discovery would not only change Michelle's fate but would expose a system of biases and mistakes that had been hiding in plain sight. The night grew longer, and Michelle stared at the ceiling of her cell, tears silently rolling down her face. She thought about all the times she had taught her students about justice, about how the truth always prevails. Now, she desperately hoped those lessons would prove true in her own life. What happened next would not only shock the court but would send ripples through the entire justice system, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, presumption of guilt, and the human cost of rushed judgments. But for now, Michelle Johnson, dedicated teacher and pillar of her community, could only wait in her cell, praying that somehow, someone would see the truth. The first rays of dawn were beginning to peek through the small window of her cell when Michelle made a decision. She would not let fear break her. Whatever was coming, she would face it with the same strength she had always taught her students to show in the face of adversity. Little did she know, her strength would be tested in ways she never imagined, and her story would soon capture the attention of the entire nation. The morning of Michelle Johnson's preliminary hearing arrived with an unexpected twist. As she was being led into the courthouse, wearing an orange jumpsuit that felt alien against her skin, Dr. Alexander Chen, Deputy Director of Cybersecurity at the NSA, was racing through Washington, D.C.'s morning traffic. His Tesla's electric engine hummed quietly as his mind raced even faster than the car. Dr. Chen had spent the entire night analyzing data patterns that initially seemed routine but had evolved into something far more disturbing. What he discovered wasn't just about Michelle Johnson's case, it was about a fundamental flaw in the system, one that had potentially affected hundreds of lives. His laptop bag, containing crucial evidence, sat heavy on the passenger seat beside him. Inside the courtroom, Michelle sat straight-backed despite her exhaustion. The judge, Honorable Patricia Reynolds, peered over her glasses at the prosecution team, who seemed unusually tense. The lead prosecutor, who had been confident to the point of smugness the previous day, was now shuffling papers with nervous energy. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, the United States government wishes to present evidence that the defendant, Michelle Johnson, accessed classified databases on multiple occasions between January and March of this year. He paused, adjusting his tie. Our digital forensics team has tracked the intrusions to her home IP address. Michelle's court-appointed defender, James Wilson, looked defeated before he even stood up. He had spent less than 15 minutes with his client and seemed more interested in plea bargaining than mounting a defense. Your Honor, my client maintains her innocence and... The courtroom doors burst open. Dr. Chen strode in, his security clearance badge prominently displayed. Behind him, 2 NSA cybersecurity analysts followed with laptops and folders. The judge's gavel crashed down as murmurs filled the room. What is the meaning of this interruption? Judge Reynolds demanded, her voice sharp with authority. Dr. Chen approached the bench, his expression grave but determined. Your Honor, I am Dr. Alexander Chen, Deputy Director of Cybersecurity at the National Security Agency. I have evidence that proves Ms. Johnson's innocence and exposes a critical error in our cybersecurity protocols. The courtroom fell silent. Michelle felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched this unexpected scene unfold. Her attorney, suddenly alert, straightened his posture. Your Honor, I request an immediate recess to review this new evidence, the prosecutor interjected, his confidence clearly shaken. Approach the bench, all of you, Judge Reynolds commanded. As the lawyers and Dr. Chen huddled around her bench, Michelle strained to hear their whispered conversation. The NSA analysts began setting up their equipment, their faces serious and focused. What Dr. Chen revealed next would shake the foundations of not just Michelle's case, but the entire federal cybersecurity system. His team had discovered that a sophisticated AI-powered monitoring system, recently implemented to detect cyber threats, had been inadvertently programmed with biased parameters. The system had been flagging innocent activities as suspicious based on demographic data, creating a pattern of false positives that disproportionately affected minority communities. In Ms. Johnson's case, Dr. Chen explained to the now-wrapped courtroom, her regular access to educational websites and teaching resources was flagged as suspicious simply because it didn't fit the system's narrow definition of normal behavior for her demographic profile. The IP address matching was coincidental, the real intrusions came from a cybercafe 3 states away. Michelle felt tears welling up in her eyes as the truth began to emerge. All those hours spent late at night researching new teaching methods, creating interactive lessons for her students, and participating in online educational forums, activities that should have marked her as a dedicated teacher, had instead been twisted into evidence against her. The prosecutor's case was crumbling by the minute. Dr. Chen's team presented graph after graph, chart after chart, showing how the biased algorithm had created a pattern of false accusations. Michelle's case wasn't an isolated incident, it was just the one that finally caught someone's attention. Judge Reynolds listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with each revelation. The gallery, which had slowly filled with press and curious courthouse staff, buzzed with whispered conversations. This was no longer just about one teacher's wrongful arrest, it was about the intersection of technology, justice, and human bias. As the morning wore on, Dr. Chen's evidence painted a clear picture of systemic failure. The very tools designed to protect national security had instead created a web of suspicion around innocent citizens. Michelle Johnson, dedicated teacher and community member, had become caught in that web simply because she didn't fit the system's predetermined notion of normal. The judge called for a brief recess to review all the new evidence. As the courtroom emptied, Michelle remained seated, still trying to process everything she had heard. Her attorney, now fully engaged, was furiously taking notes and consulting with Dr. Chen's team. For the first time since her arrest, she felt a glimmer of hope. But even as relief began to wash over her, Michelle couldn't help but wonder about others who might have been wrongly accused. How many other lives had been disrupted by this flawed system? The answer to that question would soon spark a national conversation about justice, technology, and the importance of human oversight in an increasingly automated world. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Judge Reynolds' chambers had been a flurry of activity during the break, with senior Justice Department officials arriving in a steady stream. The small county courthouse was now the epicenter of what was quickly becoming a national story. Michelle watched as her small court-appointed attorney, James Wilson, transformed before her eyes. Gone was the defeated demeanor, in its place was a determined legal professional who sensed the gravity of the moment. He huddled with Dr. Chen's team, absorbing the technical details they shared in hushed tones. "Your Honor," Wilson began as the session resumed, "we move to dismiss all charges against Ms. Johnson immediately." His voice carried a confidence that hadn't been there earlier. "Furthermore, we request an immediate investigation into all similar cases processed through this flawed system." The lead prosecutor, David Harrison, stood up slowly. His face showed the strain of someone whose world had just been turned upside down. "Your Honor, the government needs time to review all the evidence Dr. Chen has presented. We cannot simply, time." Judge Reynolds interrupted, her voice sharp. "Mr. Harrison, how much time did Ms. Johnson have when your team arrested her in front of her neighbors? How much time did she have to prepare her students for her absence?" The judge removed her glasses, fixing Harrison with a stern look. "The evidence before me shows not just a mistake, but a systemic failure." From her seat, Michelle could see reporters sketching furiously in their notepads. A courthouse artist captured the scene with swift, sure strokes: the stern judge, the wilting prosecutor, the determined NSA official, and Michelle herself, still in her orange jumpsuit but sitting straighter now, hope visible in her posture. Dr. Chen stepped forward again, his laptop projecting data onto the courtroom screen. "Your Honor, if I may demonstrate the full scope of this issue." At the judge's nod, he began explaining how the AI system's biases had evolved over time. The algorithm was designed to learn from patterns, he explained, his words careful and clear. But it learned from historical data that already contained human biases. When Michelle Johnson accessed educational websites late at night to prepare lessons, the system flagged it as suspicious simply because it didn't match its pre-programmed expectations for someone of her demographic profile. The courtroom watched in silence as Dr. Chen showed how the system had created a digital profile of Michelle that bore little resemblance to reality. Her dedication to education, spending hours researching teaching methods, participating in online workshops, and creating digital resources for her students, had been twisted into something sinister by cold lines of code. The system didn't see a dedicated teacher, Dr. Chen continued, his voice growing passionate. It saw patterns it was programmed to find suspicious. When Ms. Johnson accessed educational databases at 2 a.m. while preparing for her classes, the algorithm flagged it as potential cyber espionage. When she downloaded teaching resources from international education websites, it marked it as suspicious data transfer. Michelle felt a surge of anger as she realized how her devotion to her students had been used against her. She thought of all the late nights spent preparing engaging lessons, the weekends dedicated to professional development, the early mornings reviewing new teaching techniques, all twisted by an unfeeling algorithm into evidence of crimes she never committed. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her attention focused on a particular graph Dr. Chen was displaying. "Dr. Chen, are you suggesting that this system has been making similar errors in other cases?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied gravely. Our preliminary review suggests hundreds of potential false flags across multiple jurisdictions. The system's bias didn't just affect Ms. Johnson, it created a pattern of digital profiling that disproportionately targeted certain communities. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Several journalists slipped out of the courtroom, phones already pressed to their ears. This was no longer just about one wrongfully accused teacher, it was about the fundamental fairness of digital surveillance and artificial intelligence in law enforcement. Michelle's attorney seized the moment. "Your Honor, given this evidence, we move not only for dismissal but for a formal inquiry into all cases processed through this system." Ms. Johnson's experience must serve as a catalyst for change. The prosecutor stood again, but this time his demeanor was different. "Your Honor, in light of Dr. Chen's evidence, the government withdraws all charges against Ms. Johnson." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Furthermore, we support the call for a review of similar cases." Judge Reynolds nodded slowly, her expression grave. "Ms. Johnson, please stand." Michelle rose on shaky legs, her heart pounding. "This court finds no evidence to support the charges against you. You are free to go, with this court's sincere apologies for what you have endured." The words, "charges dismissed," echoed through the courtroom, but Michelle barely heard them. Her mind was already racing to her students, her classroom, her life that had been so abruptly interrupted. But as she listened to Judge Reynolds ordering a comprehensive review of the AI system and all cases it had influenced, she realized this was bigger than her personal vindication. As court officers moved to process her release, Michelle caught Dr. Chen's eye. He gave her a small nod, acknowledging the role her case would play in exposing a broken system. This wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about ensuring no one else would suffer the same injustice. But even as relief flooded through her, Michelle knew this was just the beginning. The real work, rebuilding her life, helping others who had been wrongly accused, and fixing the system that had failed so many, was just beginning. The question now was, how many others were out there, their lives disrupted by an algorithm's bias, waiting for justice to finally see them as people, not patterns? The day Michelle Johnson walked out of the courthouse, the world seemed different. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters called out questions, their voices blending into a confused chorus. But Michelle's attention was fixed on one sight, her elderly mother standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, supported by two of Michelle's fellow teachers. The reunion was tearful, captured by dozens of cameras but feeling intensely private. "Baby, I knew you couldn't have done those things," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "I told everyone who would listen." Michelle held her mother tightly, feeling the familiar scent of lavender that had always meant home and safety. But even as Michelle yearned to retreat into the comfort of her family, she knew this story was bigger than her personal ordeal. Dr. Chen approached them, his normally composed face showing signs of fatigue after his long night of investigation. "Ms. Johnson, I know you've been through a lot, but there's something you should see." Inside a makeshift command center set up in a nearby federal building, dozens of analysts were poring over cases flagged by the same AI system that had wrongly accused Michelle. The room hummed with activity, filled with the soft clicking of keyboards and murmured conversations. On large screens, data scrolled endlessly, each line representing someone's life potentially upended by algorithmic bias. "We've identified 347 cases so far," Dr. Chen explained, gesturing to the screens. "People flagged for suspicious activity that, when examined properly, turns out to be perfectly innocent behavior." He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "A nurse accessing medical databases during night shifts. A graduate student downloading research papers from international universities. A community organizer coordinating with overseas aid organizations." Michelle's heart sank as she looked at the data. Each case represented someone like her, a life disrupted, a reputation damaged, trust shattered. "How did we let this happen?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to Dr. Chen. "The system was designed to protect us," he replied, his voice heavy with responsibility. "But in our rush to embrace artificial intelligence, we forgot to account for human complexity. The algorithm saw patterns but missed context. It found what it was programmed to look for, not what was actually there." Later that afternoon, Michelle stood in front of her home, key in hand, staring at her front door. Yellow crime scene tape still crossed the entrance, now limp and fluttering in the breeze. Inside, she knew her laptop and other devices would be gone, taken as evidence. But what struck her most was the silence: no children's laughter from the playground across the street, no neighbors walking their dogs. Her arrest had cast a shadow over the entire community. As she stepped inside, her phone buzzed with messages. Her school principal, expressing relief and offering her position back. Parents of her students, sharing messages of support. But one message caught her eye: an invitation to speak at a hastily organized civil rights conference about AI and justice. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Journalists wanted interviews. Advocacy groups sought her support. Law firms offered to represent her in civil suits. But Michelle found herself drawn to the cases Dr. Chen had uncovered, the other lives affected by the same flawed system. She met some of them in person. There was Robert Thompson, a community college professor whose research into historical social movements had triggered the system's alerts. Lisa Patel, a medical researcher whose late-night access to global health databases had been flagged as suspicious. Each story echoed her own: lives disrupted by an algorithm that saw threats in ordinary dedication. A week after her release, Michelle stood at the front of her classroom again. Her students had decorated her desk with welcome back cards and flowers. But as she looked at their young faces, she saw something new in their eyes: questions about justice, about trust, about the intersection of technology and human judgment. Ms. Johnson, one of her students asked during their morning circle time, "Are computers always right?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Michelle thought carefully before answering. "Computers are tools," she said finally. "Like any tool, they're only as good as the people who create and use them. That's why it's so important to think critically and always consider the human story behind the data." As she spoke those words, across the country, changes were already beginning. The Justice Department announced a comprehensive review of all AI-assisted investigations. Tech companies scrambled to audit their algorithms for similar biases. Civil rights organizations began pushing for new legislation requiring transparency and human oversight in automated decision-making systems. Dr. Chen's team continued their work, methodically reviewing cases and clearing names. But he also began speaking at technical conferences, sharing Michelle's story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked artificial intelligence. "We created these systems to make our world safer," he would say, "but we forgot that justice requires more than pattern recognition. It requires understanding, empathy, and human wisdom." Michelle found herself becoming an unlikely advocate for digital justice. Her experience as an educator helped her explain complex technical concepts in ways that resonated with ordinary people. She started a support group for others affected by algorithmic bias, creating a space where they could share their stories and heal together. But perhaps the most profound change was happening in her own classroom. Her students, inspired by her story, began asking deeper questions about technology and justice. They started a project examining how computers make decisions and the importance of human oversight. What had begun as a personal nightmare was transforming into a powerful lesson about resilience, justice, and the need to balance technological progress with human values. As spring turned to summer, Michelle stood at her classroom window, watching her students during recess. The playground was alive with laughter and movement, patterns of joy that no algorithm could properly categorize. She thought about how close she had come to losing all of this, and about all the others still fighting to reclaim their lives from digital misconceptions. The national media dubbed it the algorithm trial, but for Michelle Johnson, it was becoming something far more personal. 3 months after her release, she sat in a packed auditorium at the National Civil Rights Conference in Washington, D.C., preparing to address hundreds of activists, tech experts, and policymakers. Her mother sat in the front row, beaming with pride. "When they arrested me," Michelle began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I thought I was alone. I thought my story was unique." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I was wrong. My story was just one thread in a larger tapestry of lives disrupted by automated injustice." The audience listened intently as she shared not just her story, but the stories of others she'd met through her newly formed advocacy group, Digital Justice Initiative. Her organization had already helped identify and support over 500 individuals wrongly flagged by various AI systems across the country. Meanwhile, Dr. Chen had become a regular figure in congressional hearings. Today, he sat behind Michelle on the stage, ready to provide technical context to her human testimony. Their unlikely partnership had become a powerful force for change, combining emotional impact with technical expertise. "Last week," Michelle continued, "I received a letter from a grandmother in Ohio. She'd been denied a loan because an AI system flagged her spending patterns as irregular." The irregular activity? Buying school supplies for her grandchildren every August. The audience murmured in recognition. Another letter came from a small business owner in Florida, whose international payments to craft suppliers were flagged as suspicious simply because they didn't fit the system's narrow definition of normal business transactions. As Michelle spoke, screens behind her displayed anonymous data showing the pattern of AI bias across different communities. The statistics were stark, but it was the human stories that moved people to action. She had learned that numbers alone didn't change hearts, stories did. In the months since her release, Michelle had witnessed remarkable changes. Her case had sparked a national conversation about the role of artificial intelligence in decision-making. Tech companies were now required to include human oversight in their AI systems. The Justice Department had established a new division specifically focused on algorithmic bias. But the most significant changes were happening at the community level. Michelle's experience had inspired a grassroots movement of citizens demanding transparency in automated systems. Local governments were passing ordinances requiring regular audits of AI-driven decisions affecting their communities. After her speech, a young woman approached Michelle with tears in her eyes. "My brother is still in prison," she said quietly. "The evidence against him came from the same type of system that accused you." Michelle embraced her, feeling the weight of work still to be done. That evening, Michelle met with Dr. Chen and a team of civil rights attorneys in a hotel conference room. The walls were covered with flowcharts showing the complex web of automated systems affecting everyday lives, from loan applications to job screenings, from security clearances to college admissions. "We've identified a pattern," one of the attorneys explained, pointing to a cluster of data points. "The AI systems aren't just making isolated mistakes. They're reinforcing existing societal biases by learning from flawed historical data." Dr. Chen nodded, his expression grave. "The good news is that we're making progress. The bad news is that these systems are deeply embedded in our society. Changing them requires not just technical fixes, but cultural shifts." Michelle thought about her students back home. She'd turned her experience into a teaching opportunity, helping them understand both the power and limitations of technology. They were working on a class project about ethical AI, interviewing community members about their experiences with automated systems. The next morning, Michelle visited the newly established Office of Digital Justice at the Department of Justice. The corridors buzzed with activity as teams of lawyers and technologists worked together to review cases flagged by AI systems. Her case had led to the creation of this office, but its mission had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. "We've cleared over 1,000 cases so far," the office director told her, "but we're finding new ones every day. Your case was just the tip of the iceberg." She showed Michelle a map of the United States, dotted with pins representing cases under review. Each pin represents someone's life, someone's story. Back in her hotel room that night, Michelle scrolled through emails from supporters and fellow advocates. One message caught her attention, an invitation to speak at a major tech company's annual developer conference. They wanted her to help train the next generation of AI developers about the human impact of their work. As she prepared for bed, Michelle thought about how much had changed in just 3 months. Her arrest had nearly destroyed her life, but it had also awakened her to a calling she never expected. She was no longer just a teacher, though she still considered that her most important role. She had become a voice for those who had been silenced by algorithms. Her phone buzzed with a text from one of her students. "Ms. Johnson, guess what? My mom's bank approved her loan today. They had a real person review her case like you taught us to ask for." Michelle smiled, realizing that change was happening not just in Washington's corridors of power, but in countless small ways in communities across the country. Tomorrow, she would meet with lawmakers to discuss new legislation requiring regular audits of AI systems used in law enforcement. Next week, she would return to her classroom, where her students were eager to share their findings from their ethical AI project. The work was far from over, but every small victory, every life restored, every system made more just, reminded her why this fight was so important. As she drifted off to sleep, Michelle thought about all the others still out there, their lives disrupted by cold algorithms that couldn't see their humanity. Her own nightmare had ended, but for many, the struggle continued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to create change. And she would be ready, armed with her experience, her voice, and her unwavering belief in the power of human understanding. 6 months after her release, Michelle Johnson stood in front of a very different kind of audience. The Silicon Valley auditorium was filled with tech developers, programmers, and AI engineers, the very people who created systems like the one that had wrongly accused her. But today, they weren't there to present their latest innovations. They were there to learn about humanity. "Before you write a single line of code," Michelle began, her voice carrying through the hushed room, "I want you to think about the faces behind the data. Every data point in your systems represents a real person, with hopes, dreams, and a life that can be shattered by a single misclassification." The presentation screens behind her showed images from the Digital Justice Initiative's latest campaign, ordinary people whose lives had been upended by AI decisions. A small business owner whose international suppliers were flagged as security risks. A healthcare worker whose night shift internet usage pattern triggered surveillance alerts. A community organizer whose multilingual social media presence was labeled suspicious. Dr. Chen sat in the audience, nodding approvingly. Their partnership had evolved over the months. He provided the technical expertise, while Michelle brought the human perspective that many in the tech world had overlooked. Together, they had become powerful advocates for ethical AI development. "Last week," Michelle continued, "I received a call from a teacher in Arizona. Like me, she spent her evenings researching new teaching methods and creating materials for her students. Like me, she was flagged by an AI system. But unlike me, she had somewhere to turn." Michelle paused, letting the words sink in. "Because of what we learned from my case, there are now safeguards in place." Her flag was reviewed by human eyes. Her story was heard. Her life wasn't disrupted. The audience shifted uncomfortably, many taking notes. These were the people who could prevent future injustices, but only if they understood the real-world impact of their work. After the presentation, a young programmer approached Michelle, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I helped design a similar system 2 years ago," she admitted. "We never thought about we never considered. Michelle touched her arm gently, understanding the weight of realization. Back in her hometown, changes were visible too. The school district had implemented new privacy protections for staff and student data. Michelle's classroom had become a laboratory for digital citizenship, where students learned not just how to use technology, but how to question it. That afternoon, Michelle visited the local FBI field office, the same one where she had been detained months ago. But this time, she wasn't there as a suspect. She had been invited to train agents on the importance of human oversight in digital investigations. The system flagged me because it saw patterns, she explained to the agents. It saw late-night internet activity and thought, suspicious. It saw international educational website access and thought, threat. What it didn't see was a dedicated teacher preparing for her students. It didn't see me. The agents listened intently, many taking notes. One of them, Agent Thompson, had been part of the team that arrested her. Today, he sat in the front row, his face showing the weight of lessons learned. During the break, he approached her. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I owe you an apology. We trusted the system more than our own judgment. We forgot that behind every alert, there's a human story that needs to be heard." Michelle's work was making waves beyond law enforcement. The Digital Justice Initiative had grown into a national organization, with chapters in every state. They provided support for those wrongly flagged by AI systems, advocated for policy changes, and worked with tech companies to develop more ethical algorithms. One evening, as Michelle reviewed cases in her home office, she received an unexpected email. A major tech company wanted to create a position for her, Chief Human Impact Officer. They wanted her to review their AI systems from a human perspective, to find the blind spots before they became someone else's nightmare. The offer was tempting, but Michelle's heart remained in her classroom. She had seen how her story had impacted her students, teaching them lessons no textbook could convey. They had learned to think critically about technology, to question automated decisions, and to stand up for human dignity in a digital age. Still, she agreed to serve as a consultant, bridging the gap between Silicon Valley's innovations and Main Street's realities. Her experiences had taught her that change required working from both inside and outside the system. That weekend, Michelle attended a community meeting where local businesses were discussing their experiences with AI systems. A restaurant owner shared how his irregular ordering patterns, buying ingredients from small, local farms, had triggered fraud alerts. A craftsman explained how his international sales had been blocked because they didn't fit standard business models. "We're not against technology," Michelle told the group. "We're for humanity. We're for systems that serve people, not the other way around." The meeting was interrupted by breaking news. Congress had just passed the Algorithmic Justice Act, legislation that Michelle and Dr. Chen had helped shape. The law required regular audits of AI systems used in public decisions, mandated human review of significant automated flags, and established clear appeals processes for those affected by AI decisions. Later that night, Michelle sat on her porch, watching the sunset. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages about the new law, but her mind was on tomorrow's lesson plan. She was teaching her students about ethical decision-making in the digital age, using her own story as a case study. The neighborhood had changed too. Where once there had been whispers and averted eyes after her arrest, now there was understanding. Her story had opened people's eyes to the vulnerabilities they all shared in an automated world. More importantly, it had shown them the power of standing together against injustice, whether perpetrated by humans or algorithms. As darkness fell, Michelle thought about all the lives still affected by biased AI systems. The work wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. But every person who learned from her story, every system that was made more just, every life that wasn't disrupted because of the changes her case had sparked, was a victory worth celebrating. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to bridge the gap between technology and humanity. But tonight, Michelle Johnson, teacher turned advocate, smiled at the stars and felt hope for a future where justice wasn't just computed, it was understood, felt, and truly served. 1 year after her arrest, Michelle Johnson stood at a podium in the East Room of the White House. Behind her, the President of the United States waited to sign the Algorithmic Justice and Transparency Act, legislation that had grown from the seeds of her case. The room was filled with advocates, lawmakers, tech leaders, and others whose lives had been touched by automated injustice. A year ago today, I was wearing an orange jumpsuit, accused of crimes I didn't commit, Michelle began, her voice steady and clear. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a witness to the power of change. This law isn't just about preventing false accusations, it's about preserving human dignity in the digital age. Dr. Chen sat in the front row, alongside members of the Congressional Black Caucus who had championed the legislation. The law they had helped craft went beyond simple reforms. It established the National Office of AI Ethics and Oversight, required regular audits of automated decision systems, and provided resources for those wrongly impacted by AI decisions. After the ceremony, Michelle found herself in a quiet corner with Dr. Chen, both of them watching the continued celebrations. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" she asked him. He shook his head, smiling. "When I first discovered the flaw in the system, I thought I was just fixing a technical error. You showed me it was about so much more." He paused, considering his next words. "You know, we've identified and cleared over 2,000 cases since yours. Each one represents a life that could have been destroyed." The impact of Michelle's case had rippled far beyond government policy. Major tech companies had established ethics boards with community representatives. Universities were creating new programs in algorithmic justice, combining technical expertise with social understanding. Michelle herself had been invited to serve as a visiting professor at several prestigious institutions. But her heart remained in her elementary school classroom, where she saw the most profound changes happening. Her students had grown into thoughtful critics of technology, always asking the crucial question, who might this hurt? The day after the White House ceremony, Michelle returned to her classroom to find her students buzzing with excitement. They had watched the signing ceremony on television, proud to see their teacher helping shape national policy. But today's lesson wasn't about her White House visit, it was about the local impact of their work. "Remember when we started our Technology and Community project?" Michelle asked her class. "Well, today we have some visitors who want to tell you how your work has made a difference." Into the classroom walked several community members whose lives had been affected by AI systems, and who had found help through the student-led technology awareness program. There was Mrs. Rivera, the local baker whose small business loans had been repeatedly denied by automated systems until the students helped her appeal. Mr. Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, whose medical insurance claims had been flagged as fraudulent because his treatment patterns didn't fit standard algorithms. Ms. Thompson, the librarian whose international book orders had triggered security alerts. Each shared their story with the class, showing the students how their understanding of technology and justice could create real change in their community. The children listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about how systems could be made fairer. Later that afternoon, Michelle received an unexpected visitor, Agent Thompson, the FBI agent who had been part of her arrest team. He had transferred to the newly formed AI Ethics Division and was now training other agents on the importance of human oversight in investigations. "Your case changed everything," he told her as they walked through the school halls. "We're not just looking at data anymore, we're looking at lives. Every alert, every flag, every algorithm gets human eyes and human judgment." The changes weren't limited to American shores. Michelle's story had sparked international interest in algorithmic justice. She had been invited to speak at the United Nations about the global impact of AI bias. Countries around the world were studying the American reforms, adapting them to their own contexts. That evening, Michelle attended a community meeting of the Digital Justice Initiative, which had grown from her small support group into a national organization with international partnerships. The meeting was held in the same church basement where she had first shared her story with others who had been wrongly accused. "A year ago, we were victims seeking justice," she told the gathered crowd. "Today, we're advocates creating change. But our work isn't done. Every day, somewhere in the world, someone faces judgment from an algorithm that can't see their humanity." The initiative had evolved beyond just helping those wrongly accused. They now worked with tech companies to test new systems for bias, consulted with governments on policy, and educated communities about their rights in the digital age. But most importantly, they provided hope, showing that even the most sophisticated technology could be challenged and changed when it failed to serve human needs. As Michelle drove home that night, she passed the courthouse where her case had been dismissed a year ago. The building looked the same, but everything else had changed. The justice system now had new safeguards, technology companies had new responsibilities, and communities had new ways to protect their rights. At home, Michelle found a letter waiting for her. It was from a teacher in South Korea who had read about her case and was fighting similar battles with automated systems in her country. The letter reminded Michelle that her story had become something larger than herself. It had become a symbol of hope for people around the world fighting to be seen as human beings, not just data points. As she prepared for bed, Michelle's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. The preliminary results from the first national audit of AI systems in law enforcement had come in. The data showed a significant reduction in false positives since the new oversight measures had been implemented. Lives that might have been disrupted were instead continuing normally, their stories unbroken by algorithmic errors. Michelle smiled, thinking of all the people who would never know how close they had come to being wrongly accused. Their stories would remain untold because they had never been broken. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest victories were the injustices that never happened. 18 months after her arrest, Michelle Johnson sat in her classroom after hours, grading papers as the setting sun cast long shadows across her desk. Her students had just completed their projects for the annual Digital Justice Fair, an event that had grown from a small school initiative into a citywide celebration of ethical technology and human rights. A knock at her classroom door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Dr. Chen, now the head of the National Office of AI Ethics and Oversight, standing there with a familiar expression, the one that usually meant he had news to share. "The last case has been cleared," he announced without preamble. "Every person wrongly flagged by the old system has been identified and their record expunged." He sat down at one of the small student desks, looking somewhat comical in the tiny chair. "It's over, Michelle. The system that accused you no longer exists." Michelle felt tears welling up in her eyes. Over the past 18 months, she had worked tirelessly with Dr. Chen and countless others to identify and help everyone affected by the biased AI system. Now, finally, that chapter was closing. "How many?" she asked quietly. 3,427 lives, he replied. Each one now back on track, their stories restored. He pulled out his tablet, showing her the final report. "But that's not why I'm here. We've just received funding for a new initiative, and we want you to lead it." The initiative, he explained, would bring together educators, technologists, and community leaders to create a new curriculum about digital citizenship and algorithmic justice. It would be implemented in schools nationwide, teaching the next generation how to ensure technology served humanity, not the other way around. "We're calling it the Human First Initiative," Dr. Chen said. "Because that's what you taught us, to put humans first in every equation." As they discussed the details, Michelle's phone buzzed with a news alert. The Supreme Court had just ruled unanimously in favor of strengthening AI oversight regulations, citing her case as a pivotal precedent. The decision would require all automated decision-making systems to include meaningful human review and clear appeals processes. Later that evening, Michelle attended a graduation ceremony, not for students, but for the first class of AI ethics officers trained under the new federal guidelines. The graduates included tech company employees, government officials, and community advocates, all dedicated to preventing future cases like hers. During the ceremony, she was surprised to see Agent Thompson take the stage. The FBI agent who had once arrested her was now teaching others about the importance of human judgment in law enforcement. His speech moved many to tears as he described how Michelle's case had transformed his understanding of justice. "We thought we were being objective by trusting the machines," he told the audience. "But true objectivity means seeing the whole person, not just the patterns. It means understanding that every data point has a human story behind it." After the ceremony, Michelle drove to her mother's house for their weekly dinner. These gatherings had become even more precious since her ordeal, a reminder of the simple joys that could have been lost to an algorithm's mistake. Over her mother's famous pot roast, they discussed the changes they'd seen in their community. The Neighborhood Watch program now included digital rights education. Local businesses had learned to challenge automated denials of loans and licenses. Even the public library had started workshops on digital literacy and algorithmic bias. "Remember when you used to worry about me staying up late to work on lesson plans?" Michelle asked her mother with a smile. "Now I'm teaching others to question the very systems that once questioned me." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Baby, you turned your pain into purpose. That's what real teaching is about." The next morning, Michelle stood before a new audience, a congressional committee considering expanded protections for citizens affected by artificial intelligence. As she prepared to testify, she thought about how far they'd come, and how far they still had to go. "Distinguished members of Congress," she began, "I stand before you not just as someone who was wrongly accused, but as someone who has seen both the promise and peril of automated decision-making. We cannot stop technological progress, nor should we try. But we must ensure that in our rush to embrace the future, we don't sacrifice the very things that make us human." She shared stories from the thousands of cases they'd uncovered, the small business owner who nearly lost everything because an algorithm couldn't understand her seasonal business patterns, the medical researcher whose midnight database access was flagged as suspicious, the community organizer whose multilingual outreach triggered security alerts. Each of these stories represents a moment where we had to choose between blind trust in technology and faith in human judgment, she continued. Each time we chose humanity, we made our system stronger, not weaker. As she concluded her testimony, Michelle noticed a group of her students in the gallery. They had asked to attend, wanting to see their teacher continue the work they had studied in class. Their presence reminded her why this fight mattered, because the systems they built today would shape the world these children would inherit. That evening, back in her classroom, Michelle found a stack of letters on her desk. They were from students around the country who had learned about her story through the new digital citizenship curriculum. Each letter expressed how her experience had helped them understand the importance of questioning technology and standing up for human dignity. As she read the letters, Michelle reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Her nightmare had transformed into a movement, her pain into progress, her story into a catalyst for change. The system that had once accused her was gone, replaced by something more just, more human. But perhaps the most important change was in the hearts and minds of people who now understood that justice couldn't be reduced to algorithms and data points. It required human wisdom, compassion, and the courage to question automated decisions that affected human lives. As the last light faded from her classroom windows, Michelle packed up the letters, ready to head home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to ensure that technology served humanity's best interests. But tonight, she could rest knowing that her story had helped create a world where people were seen as more than just patterns in a database, they were seen as human beings, each with a story worth hearing, a life worth protecting, and dignity worth preserving.